he has no respect for this country. I mean, he goes through this massive history lesson about how Vladimir Lenin, created Ukraine, and it was a sort of Soviet entity. It doesn't have its own independent history or legitimacy, and it was a tragic error for it to break away from the Soviets, and it has no tradition and culture of any kind of pro-Western sentiment. If you have that kind of delusional disregard for a country, then you can see why you go in and just expect it to roll over at the first sight of a tank. But what happened was, at the first sight of a tank, Ukrainians blasted it.
Good evening and welcome to another ACL update. My name's Alister Cameron and I'm not here this week with the wonderful Wendy Francis, but I do have an amazing guest to introduce to you tonight. So we're going to sit back tonight and just have a conversation about Ukraine. Over the week we just thought, you know what, this deserves special treatment. And then the next question was, who with? And we're very fortunate to have a friend in the orbit of the ACL, Dr. Jonathan Cole, who's with me tonight. And I'm really, really delighted to introduce him. So Dr. Jonathan is a scholar, a writer, a translator, that was new to me, commentator, lecturer and speaker, really living at the intersection of politics and theology. He works at the Centre for Religion, Ethics and Society at Charles Sturt, where he got his PhD in political theology. Also an MA in Islamic theology and Middle Eastern politics from ANU, and a BA in modern Greek language, which is just amazing too, and history from La Trobe. So you speak Greek, Jonathan. I didn't know that.
I do. That's the language I translate from into English.
Indeed, that's the translator bit that I was missing. So look, welcome to ACL Update.
Thanks. It's great to be having this conversation with you, Alister.
Yeah, look, I know I've got a smile on my face, and I'm really enjoying the prospect of the next half an hour, Jonathan. But it would be unfair to not acknowledge the seriousness of this conversation. There are people dying in the Ukraine. There's a lot of damage being done. It's possibly something that will take decades to untangle. It's amazing how some of the most dastardly, awful things that happen quickly, but then they take so long to clean up the mess afterwards. So let's dive straight into this, Jonathan. I should add, just by way of introduction, you've written a book, and I might promote that again at the end. I got this one signed by you at the book launch, so not many people can say that, but there we go. Really, really good read. And there's also a podcast if people want to find you. Again, we'll say this at the end, but Political Animals is your podcast, and some tremendous interviews, some of which I've listened to on that. I think you're going to, if you haven't already, be talking about the Ukraine, but maybe I'm getting in first on that subject matter.
You're definitely ahead of my podcast in that regard.
Oh, there you go. All right, good. All right, so Jonathan, I really feel like for the viewer and the listener tonight, I really want to, we could go 1,000 different ways, but I really thought I'd ask some pretty broad questions and give you a chance just to take this where you wanted to go. So I think really the first question is, how would you, in your words, describe even what's happening right now?
Yeah, well, that's actually the best place to start, isn't it? And it's not as straightforward to answer as it might sound. So, because there's a lot of unknowns, obviously. How about I say what I think we do know about what is going on right now, and then maybe point out a couple of the most significant areas of ignorance for all of us. So these are the key facts that we know, is that Putin about 11 days ago ordered his, we estimate, 150,000 assembled force to invade Ukraine through multiple axes from the north, south, and east. I'm pretty confident in saying that the ultimate strategy, whatever other sort of sub-strategies may have been attached to it, was to depose the Zelensky government in Kyiv, and we assume, and I think it's a safe assumption, install a more Russia-friendly, pro-Kremlin prime minister or president who could address some of those grievances that Putin has stated publicly. Now, whether the strategy was to conquer the whole country or to just intimidate the government into resigning, or the Ukrainian troops into capitulating and surrendering quickly, we don't know the full extent of what the sort of longer term ambition was, but it's pretty clear that the original operational strategy was, quite frankly, an abysmal failure and really a kind of humiliation for Russia. And that's because of a couple of very serious miscalculations on the part of Putin, certainly, and or his military planners. And that was that he thought just sending in fairly lightly armed units that just sort of hurtled through Ukraine into the major cities and clearly didn't expect serious resistance, a couple of missile strikes, aerial bombardments on key Ukrainian military installations. And I think the assumption was within a couple of days, the Zelensky government would either have sued for peace or the Ukrainian soldiers would have fled or surrendered. And so the grossest miscalculation was he totally underestimated both Zelensky and the resolve of his government, but also the Ukrainian military and this nationalistic sentiment in Ukraine. And so the initial plan fell apart primarily because of the extreme resistance of the Ukrainian military, clearly willing to fight and die in kind of heroic fashion, really courageous fashion to defend their nation, and this upswelling of pro-government sentiment with people, lots of civilians signing up for sort of local defense forces, and clearly a kind of military capability that this is the most perplexing part to me, underestimated. So they have the ability to shoot down Russian airplanes and helicopters. They've got anti-tank weapons and know how to use them. And so that first strategy fell apart. It's clear now that the Russians are resetting and they're now they've changed their tactics and strategy. I think the ultimate strategy is still the same. They want to get rid of Zelensky, presumably install a pro-Russian puppet is the language we use. I think that's reasonable. Yes. So now they're trying to amass larger forces. And
now, just before we go on to just before we go on to what they're doing now, I'm also observing, or I'm hearing the analysis that many Russian soldiers were ill-prepared, not well-trained. It's almost like the B team went in. Is the sense that some people are getting, that they were really expecting to come in as not peacekeepers, but as liberators. And when they discovered that the Ukraine were not welcoming them, it was almost surprising to them. It's like they'd been worded up that it'd be an easy thing. Like, don't sweat it, it's easy. They're going to love you for being there. You know, like they're waiting to be liberated from this terrible tyranny. And that makes sense in the sense of the sort of regime that Russia is would potentially have locked really tight on a certain message that made people, Russian military, want to go in there. That's the first thing I've read. Another thing I was looking at was something to the effect that the spring, kind of late summer, late winter, spring conditions in the Ukraine have actually made it quite treacherous with mud and other things for the Russians. So if you watch the way that they've kind of attempted to sort of find their way into the Ukraine, it's like spiders' webs. They've had to sort of follow roads. They can't get off the roads. If they do, the trucks bog. So it's been a bit comedic almost in terms of the mess they've made of it. So you get this sense of people who didn't know what they were going to find, who thought it was going to be easy, it was hard. The whole thing's miscalculated.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. And it really is baffling to some degree, but I think you can explain it partly by Putin's own delusion, because it's very clear, even from the professed reasons that he gave to the Russian people in that television address that goes for 60 minutes in Russian, that there are versions in English that I and others have listened to. It's quite clear that he has no respect for this country. I mean, he goes through this massive history lesson about how Vladimir Lenin, created Ukraine, and it was a sort of Soviet entity. It doesn't have its own independent history or legitimacy, and it was a tragic error for it to break away from the Soviets, and it has no tradition and culture of any kind of pro-Western sentiment. If you have that kind of delusional disregard for a country, then you can see why you go in and just expect it to roll over at the first sight of a tank. But what happened was, at the first sight of a tank, Ukrainians blasted it. And this just shows that he doesn't actually understand the kind of people, the nation that he's dealing with, nor the government and its strong resolve. And at a personal level, I think he clearly miscalculated the character of Zelensky, perhaps forgivable, because I don't think anyone in the West expected this comedian come politician to become this kind of celebrity hero figure in the press. But you're right, because they expected this quick, easy victory, the Russian military wasn't configured and set up for the kind of more arduous, much longer, as it's going to be now, much bloodier combat that's going to be required to root out the Ukrainian resistance, particularly in the big urban centers. And so, it's not a small undertaking to make sure what is now, we think, close to 150,000 troops, Russian troops in various parts of Ukraine. You've got to feed these people. They have to have water. They need to rest and sleep in safety without being killed and bombed. They need ammunition. They need to. It's very easy to expend a lot of ammunition, and you need parts to repair the vehicles, because I understand tanks and armored personnel characters are sort of shall we say, temperamental pieces of hardware, and particularly in war conditions, you need mechanics, and so there's this massive logistical challenge.
They need to have been well maintained to start with, and I've been hearing there's such tremendous corruption. Military vehicles that you need to run them monthly, like you need to keep them rolling, because the minute you don't, things go wrong on them.
Yeah.
And there's this suggestion that the Russians discovering just how well things were not maintained, and it's coming out while they're on the field.
I think that's definitely a big part of it, and there's a sort of a truth about conflict and armies, and that is you never really know what the true capability of a military force, particularly because part of it's a human thing. It's to do with morale. We're talking about people who have to be willing to kill and be killed in order to prevail. So the resolve and the morale is a key factor that can be decisive, and it's one thing, incidentally, that can mean a smaller force can actually overcome a larger force if they can smash the morale and the resolve of the enemy. But I think we all assumed that because Russia has this kind of ex-post-Soviet military, it's massive. We've heard about its modernization over the last couple of decades, and they've certainly improved their equipment. It's always been regarded as one of the most potent, capable militaries on the planet. But of course, it hasn't really been deployed in an operation like this before, certainly not since the invasion of Afghanistan in the 80s. And there, with all respect to the Afghan defenders, they were not facing a conventional opponent that had, the capability, anti-air defenses. And I mean, Ukraine's got its own armor, it's got its own tanks. It's a proper, legitimate army. It's got its own special forces who are doing a lot of the damage behind the lines, from what I can gather.
And is it fair to say that it's getting an awful lot of help now? It's taken a few days to organise, but there's a lot of military hardware coming in from around the world into the Ukraine, is my understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, one of the shocks to me is that the Russians don't have air superiority. It's hard for me to know exactly why, but clearly the Ukrainians have been able to deny that. And that's one of the key factors that I assume the Russians were banking on, and that would have made a huge difference. But there's a real danger to Russian helicopters and aircraft that really limits their ability to support troops in combined arms operation, which then means that allows Ukrainian soldiers to mount all of these ambushes and to really stand their ground in the city, because they're not at the kind of danger they would be, say, from an American Air Force that would be really, the soldiers on the ground would be calling in airstrikes or helicopter gunships to come in and take out entrenched positions in front of them. So that's all by way of saying it's possible we all actually overestimated, including Putin and all Western analysts, the capability of the Russian army, because it was kind of theoretical, really, because we haven't seen them, as I say, engaged in this kind of conflict. Conversely, the thing we all forget is that the Ukrainian military has been at war for the last 7 to 8 years.
Yes.
So it has a cadre of commanders that have combat experience. And yes, they weren't facing the Russian army, but they were facing Russian armed and backed rebels in the east. And yes, they didn't prevail in that war, but you have to assume there's a lot of combat experience in the Ukrainian army. They will have learnt a lot of hard lessons, which can only come from combat. And one of the things that has been surprising, but I think can be explained possibly by the actual experience, is that the Ukrainian General Command clearly have played this very intelligently. This is one of those gaps I'm talking about. We don't even know exactly how many troops Ukraine has. We don't know where they are. One of the odd things about this conflict is we know far more about where the Russian troops are and what they're doing, and we're getting a lot of footage of the aftermath of those battles. I don't know if it's that the Ukrainians aren't leaking as much. I guess there are few sympathizers in Ukraine to kind of leak what they're doing. But I think it's safe to assume they, with whatever resources they have used them actually quite intelligently to do what no one, I think, expected them to do, which is to really halt the Russian advance at a pretty early stage in the conflict. And so I think that probably has something to do with experience. You'd have to assume that all of those senior commanders have been involved to some extent with the war in eastern Ukraine that goes back to
They'd know the ground
2014.
well.
Yeah, and they know how to plan operations, how to defend, how to move troops. They've probably actually got better logistical support. I mean, they have some home ground advantages, obviously, and they're fighting amongst the friendly population. So there's a lot of obstacles and difficulties that the Russians have.
Now, there's so much I'd like to ask. I'd like to ask about the makeup of the population in the East, and shouldn't they be sympathetic to Russia because they're Russians? And, you know, where's the dividing line between the real Ukraine and the sort of proxy Russians? I don't know that time permits. What I'd really love to just get back to is, I guess, that high-level question of what is Putin actually trying to achieve? Is this a reconstitution of the USSR boundaries? Is it a protest against an encroaching NATO? I think a lot of people are really just trying to get that basic question answered. What's he trying to do?
Yeah, well, particularly in light of how poorly the invasion has gone for the Russian side in the first 11 days, it begs the question, why on earth has he embarked on an incredibly risky, costly exercise? And I don't know that we know the answer to that purely. There's a lot of commentators who seem to think they can get into Putin's mind, and there's a lot of possible reasons and rationales, but I don't think we can explain the actual gamble, because he's always presented as a rational actor, and for all intents and purposes, he's a rational actor, a highly calculated, devious one, perhaps, but he never had that sense of the crazy about him. And so why has he flown the coop, so to speak, is difficult to say, but we can point to a couple of things that he has said publicly that seem to justify, or I don't mean justify, but a sort of rationale justification from his perspective. And I go back to that 60-minute lecture, and it really is like a lecture. It's a historical lecture. Goes right back to the start of the Russian Revolution for 60 minutes. I mean, think about a leader speaking for 60 minutes. He didn't look like he had any notes. It was just like a sort of extemporaneous speech. And it's clear that for him, this is more than just, NATO membership, although that's definitely part of it. It's more than just Western policy, a feeling of being encircled. This is historical. In some ways, leaders that think in terms of grand historical narratives are actually the most dangerous. And this is where, obviously, Hitler comparisons are perilous territory, and I'm not trying to say that this is analogous specifically to the Hitler, but that whole fascist rhetoric was a lot about destiny and history and historical grievances. That is something we see in these kind of activities. There was a bit of that with Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. Historical wrongs. It wasn't a real state. It should have been part of Iraq. They're stealing our oil and our resources. So Putin's speech was quite reminiscent of a lot of this stuff. And as I alluded to before, so I think for him, this is about addressing some historic wrongs, which was the independence of Ukraine in the first place, the breakup of the Soviet Union, not because of communism. He condemns communism repeatedly in the speech, but I think he has a problem with he seems to think nationalism, particularly nationalism amongst the former Soviet republics, is the great enemy that perhaps communism kept in place, and the post-communist regime in Russia failed to keep these ethnic minorities as part of Russia. Now, why I think Ukraine is particularly exceptional for Putin is that I don't think he sees them as an ethnic minority, apart from the fact that you have a significant Russian-speaking part of the Ukrainian citizenry out in the east. From what I understand, Ukrainian is mutually intelligible with Russian. Yes. And from Putin's perspective, clearly he's misjudged this. There is a very strong, clearly Ukrainian identity, contra to everything he says about it. It's not really pro-Western. It's part of the Russian family. He emphasizes the brotherhood and the fact that this common destiny and history together. And so I think for him, there's this kind of personal sense of grievance, which underlays some of the policy annoyances, if you like, that he has to do with NATO. But I don't think this is purely about NATO. The NATO is symptomatic of the historic wrong of this people turning its back on its Russian brothers,
Right.
and the historic Russian nation, and going with the enemies of Russia, Western Europe, NATO, and America.
There are practical realities, like it's got some of the most, it's got the greatest amount of fertile and very productive agricultural land in Europe. It's got oil, it's got other natural resources, but there are reasons why you might want it from purely an economics or a resource point of view. But clearly that doesn't explain the full story. And there's something more grander, more sort of romantic in his ideas, perhaps rational, perhaps not entirely.
I think that the key word here, Alister, is ideological.
Right.
So I think this is actually an ideological war, and ideology is more powerful in many ways than material interests alone, although that they're obviously a bonus. I mean, would he care about a tiny little country that had 300,000 people and he felt was part of Russia? Possibly not. But this is one of the largest countries in Europe, and it does have resources, and it would, if it was better integrated into Russia, really augment the Russian population, yes, economy, its military scale, and it has, it would give Russia even better control of the Black Sea. And so I think, I get the sense, this is the word I would use, I think, and this is why I think it's so dangerous, and perhaps, again, can provide some explanation into what seems inexplicable, which is when people can have a kind of ideological view of the world, they can convince themselves of all kinds of things.
Now, on that point,
I'm not convinced the Russian people necessarily agree with Putin.
No, and yes, and I've heard stories of rumors of coups in the last few days, and also, we see protests in Stalingrad and various other places, St. Petersburg. Sorry, there's a lot going around to make you wonder about the level of loyalty among the Russian people. All right, the problem with them's that's got that true religion is that when they've got a nuclear button in front of them, you wonder at their ability not to press it, because there's something about being an ideologue that is frankly cause for great concern. How far do you think he could go, given that he has a nuclear button at his disposal, at least in theory?
Yeah, and has already sort of brought nuclear weapons to some extent, not in a serious way, but in a highly provocative way, into the equation. It didn't take long for him to sort of bring the nuclear weapons in, although I think that's posturing, to be honest, but still quite unnerving and alarming that early on he would go there. And of course, there's an additional risk factor when any nuclear nation gets involved in a war, particularly when, and this is perhaps provocative, but I think it has to be said. I mean, the West is actually at war with Russia, in a way, when you think about it. That includes Australia. I mean, if we are providing lethal aid, I mean, what's that lethal aid for? It's to kill Russian soldiers. So we are a party to the conflict.
Yes.
And the main party there is America, which is a nuclear power, and you have Russia on the other side. You see the warnings that Putin is making about the sort of mooted NATO no-fly zone. I mean, I don't know exactly what he would do, but clearly he fears escalation from the other side. And that's another, just to talk about his miscalculations, the other key miscalculation he made. And again, I'm not sure I blame him for this one, because I've been surprised by the really swift, united, and vigorous response through sanctions, lethal aid, particularly from the Europeans. I mean, this is just
Germany's transformation into remarkable. A military superpower, or the decision to be one overnight, is extraordinary.
Yeah. And think about the irony of this here. Putin has this preposterous idea. The most preposterous part of his stated ambitions in Ukraine was to denazify this country that is run by a Jewish guy, and it's preposterous on a whole number of levels. I mean, there is just to give a bit of background. There is a sort of small neo-Nazi movement or white supremacist movement in Ukraine, as there is in Russia and
Yes.
Australia and America and every country just about in Europe. So if that's a pretext for war, Putin should really go to war with half the world to denazify them. There's a perverse irony here that he has encouraged the Germans, the actual country that historically, I'm not suggesting the Germans are Nazis, although they also have their own neo-Nazi movement. So there's this, I mean, it's a kind of perverse irony that he comes up with this ridiculous pretext of denazifying Ukraine and at the same time encourages Germany, which has had a certain sort of military and defense strategy directly arising out of the defeat of Nazism. And now suddenly, within 5 seconds of the invasion, the Germans have completely flipped and are going to start investing in a much larger military. And I just remind people that Germany is the largest country in Europe. It's got sort of 80, 90 million people. It's an enormous economy. There's a reason why it has been a power in the past. But I started to explain something then and I went off track. But there was this militia that formed back in 2014 with the internal civil war, really, between the parts of the Eastern Russian speaking, not the whole part of the Eastern Russian speaking, and the Ukrainian speakers. There was this kind of Azov militia.
Azov battalion or Azov something.
Azov battalion, and it's said to have, I mean, they deny it, but who knows, it's quite possible that they're certainly ultra-nationalists, and they subsequently were integrated into the Ukrainian military. And I think they're from the southern part around Odessa or that kind of area. Yes. So they are actually in the fight. But I mean, are we really to believe that Putin had no alternative but to go to war because of one battalion?
No.
In the Ukrainian army?
I'm not buying it.
Which may or may not, to some extent, have sort of white supremacist views when he has neo-Nazis in his own country. And like I say, name me a Western country that doesn't have a small and, let's face it, fairly marginal and, well, not fairly, completely marginal and politically insignificant, maybe with the exception of America, sort of white supremacy movement.
Fair point. I'm interested, you started talking about the US before, and we've talked about Germany. Is there any truth in your mind to suggesting that Russia and the Ukraine are almost proxies for a bigger battle between China, behind Russia, and the US/Europe, maybe NATO, behind the Ukraine? Is this really more of what's emerging as the sort of the great battle of the 21st century, which is this ascendant empire in China, and Russia, frankly, being almost a proxy for it, Ukraine, in this instance, being a proxy for the West? Is that really what behind the scenes is going on here? Is there a behind the scenes thing going on?
Look, I think China is certainly lurking in the background of this conflict in a kind of indirect way. And I'll say something about that in a second. But I do think we need to keep things in perspective. And it's hard when we see one nation invade another nation, and we're seeing a kind of full-scale conventional conflict that may reach the kind of scale of the kind of conflicts we saw in World War II once the Russians eventually tried to take Kyiv. This could be a massive operation with tens of thousands of troops attacking tens of thousands of defenders in a city of 3 million people. We haven't seen that kind of conflict even in Iraq and Afghanistan. We never saw that scale of conflict. But there's a low likelihood, in my view, at this stage, that the conflict spills out of Ukraine. I mean, I really don't think that even if Putin sort of, when he dreamed alone, or sat in front of the mirror and dreamed about maybe reconquering the Baltic states, I mean, we're so far from that now, given the problems he has.
Right. Well, given what the last 11 days have looked like.
Well, I mean, maybe if he eventually conquers Ukraine, and then he's got probably, in my view, got to occupy the country to prop up whatever government he puts in the face of this hostile population. To conquer it, he's going to have to destroy the Ukrainian military, so they won't be around. And then there's a high likelihood, in my view, of a kind of insurgency of some sort. So he could be bogged down there for years. I don't think he's going to be invading any other country. And I think there's very low likelihood that NATO will up its involvement beyond supplying aid military aid to Ukraine. So at this stage, nothing can be ruled out because we've been so surprised already on a whole range of levels. But I actually see a low likelihood, or put it another way, I think it looks like a pretty good chance this will remain contained, the actual fighting to Ukraine, short of other miscalculation. And it's not just Putin that has the potential to miscalculate. It's possible for America and Western nations also to miscalculate, get a bit overconfident with the sanctions, go too far, sort of up the lethal aid, maybe send in some special forces to train inside Ukraine. All kinds of things could happen here.
I've heard of one thing which I'll just get your sense check on. A decapitation strike, actually taking out Putin personally. I mean, that's been mooted in Australia. That's been mooted elsewhere. People, political analysts, military analysts have said, no, literally, an assassination strike on Putin. Is that just saber rattling? What is that?
I think that's a Hollywood fantasy, quite frankly, because to assassinate a Putin inside Moscow, incredibly difficult operation. I mean, the chances of even an American Special Forces team being able to pull that off, or them having an agent that's close enough that can get access and pull it off, it would be the most extraordinarily, in my view, provocative thing to do at this juncture in the conflict. And you'd be much better letting the Russian people do it further down the track, because I do think this is a realistic scenario.
Again, back to a Saddam Hussein scenario.
But yeah, I mean, I just think that's so crazy. I can't bring myself to believe any American president. I'm not sure what other country could even attempt this. Given the low likelihood of success, the completely unknown effects, whether you succeed or fail, you could have catastrophic consequences, because who knows what happens in Russia if Putin goes. I think the most likely scenario that sees Putin deposed is actually a military coup months down the track, in a situation where the Russians don't actually prevail in Ukraine. And I still think, the conventional logic, just again, it's a bit theoretical, but looking at the two forces, Putin's resolute to me. He doesn't look like he's going to back down. I don't think he can afford to back down. I expect him to double down. Wouldn't surprise me if we see tens of thousands additional troops pumped into Ukraine, because I just don't think he can afford to lose this now.
Does that mean conscription?
I think I think they have conscription anyway, and
right.
So some of the I've seen reports that some of the units in Ukraine are conscripts, others aren't, and so the quality varies. They've got airborne troops in places. Yeah. I'm sure they've got special forces operating, and whilst the conscripts, their morale, it seems from some of the reports we've had, but we've got to be careful to not extrapolate too much from this, seems pretty poor. I wouldn't want to, if I was a Ukrainian, I wouldn't want to come up against the Spetsnaz, Russian special forces. I'm sure the airborne divisions and the professional troops are far better trained and far more capable. And if I were the Ukrainians, I would not be making the same mistake that the Russians have made in underestimating them. Just to go back to the China question, the reason I say it's in the background is we all know that there's this parallel situation where you have a China, for the same kind of historical reasons and ideological nationalist reasons, has eyes on Taiwan, doesn't regard it as a legitimate state, publicly wants it to reintegrate or reunify with China. We know it's got a growing military capability, or I say we know, but we think we know. It's certainly expanded, and it has expanded its capabilities and increased its kind of weaponry, though it is completely untested and untried. They have not, if I'm right, been in a proper conventional conflict since fighting the Vietnamese in the late 70s, so it's been quite a while between drinks. So I think this definitely has implications for the calculations on all sides, not just the Chinese. But see, we've got to remember that it's not just the Chinese who will take lessons from this; it's also the Americans. So the Americans will be thinking, okay, do we need to? There are American voices, for example, saying they want an outright military commitment to defend Taiwan, to deter a potential Chinese invasion, because I think one of the key mistakes Biden made leading up to the Russian invasion was to take a military response off
Yes.
the table. So that I just cite that as one way that the thinking in Washington, the analysts and the National Security Council and all the military people, they're all watching this and taking lessons, as will be the Chinese. And so it's too early to predict where the chips will fall there. But the one thing I'm confident in saying is that if we forward down to a year or two, depending where the Ukraine conflicts goes, I think it's going to have a significant impact on the strategic thinking of both the Chinese military security policymakers and the American.
Yeah.
And so it definitely has a Chinese
It
dimension.
has to have, I think, but maybe we're looking further downfield. I'm aware of the time. The clock is really running down fast. I noticed that there's another dimension to battle today. There's two that I can think of that are kind of fairly novel. One is the power of social media to prosecute a message, the power of social media to galvanize people in various different ways. And the other one is just the power of economic sanctions when you live in such a globalized world. The idea that Visa and MasterCard can just flip a switch and turn off Russia. Apple Pay, Google Pay can turn off Russia. Various different suppliers, various different trade routes and relationships can just be chopped. I'm not smart enough to know what the immediate and lasting effect on the average Russian would be. But and internet websites, I mean, frankly, Facebook could turn Russia off, I'm sure, and Google could turn Russia off. And so it seems to me that the ability for the outside world through these various different technological and economic means to really make life kind of awful for the average Russian in order to perhaps challenge the otherwise kind of comprehensive ideological rah-rah message coming from the Kremlin, it's remarkable to watch.
You're absolutely right, Alister. And I think you've identified one of the real revelations that I certainly didn't see coming, I'm happy to admit, from this conflict. And that was just the speed which is enabled by technology, communications, the digital world, with which the international community, not just the West, but it was driven by the West, was able to so quickly organize and coordinate a series of sanctions. And it's not all, as you say, being driven by governments. There are multinational corporations, sporting associations making their own decisions. If you think about, say, the 1980s, let's say this conflict happened then. At about day 6, we would still be having the first person-to-person conferences that everyone would have had to travel to try and come up with a policy of sanctions. It can happen so fast now. I confess I didn't see this coming. I'm sure Putin didn't see this coming. And this is a lesson for China, if they're smart, is to see, actually, if you don't, I mean, I should just say, if Putin's original strategy worked, I don't think it would have been such a big issue. If he was in Kyiv in 2, 3, 4, even 5 days, but it's looking like weeks away from that now, possibly even months, who knows, then perhaps this would have all been moot. But the point of the technological revolution in terms of information and coordination and just the ability to flick digital switches. So, when MasterCard says we're stopping payments, I assume that can be done relatively quickly by just turning off the technology, right? So we never used to have these levers to so quickly apply pressure on the domestic population and the domestic politics and economic situation of an aggressor nation who's trying to fight a war in another country. And so the Chinese now, I think if they're smart, their calculation is, we've got actually a very small window, perhaps much smaller than we realized. If we wish to take Taiwan, it's got to be done in days,
scenario.
not weeks. If we want to avoid a massive sort of coordinated global multinational corporate civil society push, and even just the pressure on social media. I mean, I don't know what difference it makes, but certainly if you're a Russian living in somewhere in Russia and you can get access to any information, which is becoming increasingly difficult, I have to admit, it must just feel like the entire world is against you, and you can create that political effect in a way that just was so difficult to do in the past. And I don't think any of this, incidentally, will deter Putin for the same reasons I articulated just a moment ago. He cannot afford to back down, and he's certainly not going to back down because life gets a bit difficult for his people. He's in the middle of a war. That's the priority. But this is a massive distraction for a leader that's trying to run a large-scale conventional conflict to presumably conquer a country, and he now has to worry about the tanking of his currency, the problems in the stock market, the economic repercussions, and all of the issues as the leader. He must be getting a lot of briefings on the domestic economic situation, and it just completely distracts the kind of attention and just makes it that much more challenging to prosecute a war in this environment where you're under a lot of pressure. But I think sooner or later we'll max out the amount of pressure you can do with sanctions, because there is clearly a threshold after which we start to hurt ourselves as much as the Russians. And let's face it, we're not going to destroy our own economies for the sake of Ukraine, just to state.
So, Jonathan, I would love to.
Here.
Yeah, well, I feel like we've just scratched the surface. One last question. I'll give you a couple of minutes just to wrap this one up. But thinking parochially as the Australian Christian lobby, what does it mean for Australia? Any thoughts on Scott Morrison's challenge, on Peter Dutton's challenge, on what it might mean for us?
I think the significance of the lethal aid, I don't think has been comprehended in Australia yet. So whilst this conflict is very far from us, the tyranny of distance is also a blessing of distance when it comes to strategic security matters. So this conflict couldn't be further away, quite frankly, and it's very unlikely to touch Australia directly unless we go into the completely mad nuclear situation, which I do still think is unlikely, because Putin, although he's miscalculated, I think he is a rational actor. He's not crazy. And as a Russian nationalist, he doesn't want to see the end of Russia. But this is all by way of saying we have backed aside here. I'm not saying it's the wrong decision to back the side, but personally, I think this is morally unambiguous. The Russians are the aggressor here. There is really nothing that justifies invading Ukraine. I mean, it's not like, to say that somehow he had to invade is to say he had no alternative.
No one's buying
that's just crazy. Ukraine posed no military threat. The Ukrainians, after all, were completely absorbed with the Russian-backed insurgency and annexation of their own territory going back to 2014. So they were the least threat you could possibly imagine to Russia. But the point is, we are now supplying lethal aid for the purpose of trying to help Ukraine prevail in a war against the great power, not superpower, but still a power in Russia. It's hard to say what the ramifications are of that, and of course Australia's not out on its own, so in a way we're probably not right up the top of Putin's sort of animosity list, hit list. But people talk about the wounded bear, and this is a man who does execute his opponents in Western countries. I wouldn't put it past him to sponsor a terrorist attack, for example. And I think his intelligence services have that capability and the contacts. It may be Islamist, it might not be Islamist. They might fake an Islamist attack. If he gets desperate enough, he may give a green light.
He's been doing this sort of stuff all his life.
Now Australia couldn't be taken. I'm just saying worst case scenarios. I'm not saying it's likely. I'm not saying it's certain. But I just state that to really articulate the enormity of what it means to be involved in a conflict like this. We are not on the sidelines. We are sending lethal aid, and I expect we may send more lethal aid if the Ukrainians hang on long enough to make it worthwhile. And certainly it's not going to endear us to Russia, to the Putin regime in Russia. And if he survives, there may be repercussions in the bilateral relationship down the road.
Look, he will remember. Dr. Jonathan Cole, I am really grateful for your time. We've hit the 40-plus minute mark, and so that's a bit over time, but I feel like we've just scratched the surface. I didn't mention you have a background in intelligence as well, working for the Australian government, and I can see that clarity of thinking and that ability to really research coming through really, really clearly. So, dear viewer, I hope this has been really helpful for you too in just gaining a sense of clarity and perspective, and perhaps this raises more questions, and that's not a bad thing either. So, Dr. Jonathan Cole at jonathancole.com.au, a fabulous podcast. Just Google political animals on your favourite podcasting platform and it will show up. We're done for another week. Jonathan, I'm almost tempted to say if this thing goes on, we're going to have you back for another chat in a few weeks' time. We'll see how we go about that, but it's definitely an extraordinary time to be alive. We encourage Christians everywhere to be praying and thoughtful and researched, not believing everything that you hear just because you heard it from your favourite news channel or your favourite friend. There's a lot of research that we need to do, and we're doing the best we can at the Australian Christian Lobby. Look forward to seeing you all again next week. Thank you so much.